Okay, so we're going to talk about the abolition of man here, and we'll see how long I'm going to take to get through that and whether I can move on a little bit to get back to that hideous strength. But I wanted to deal with this text and interrupt the discussion of the trilogy, space trilogy, because Lewis writes, or rather is given the opportunity to deliver a series of lectures up at the University of Durham on the 3 lectures, the Riddle Memorial Lectures, which ends up being written up as a volume that is eventually called The Abolition of Man, which is actually the 3rd chapter in the book, which begins with, I won't put it up there because I have it on the actual 3rd chapter, discussing first what he calls men without chests, and then the Tao, and then the 3rd chapter, the actual abolition of man. Now, when I was looking for an image for this beforehand, I noted, and I have various copies of the Abolition of Man, and none of them can actually portray on the cover what is entailed in the book. And that's sort of interesting. Whereas this French edition of it, L'Abolition de l'Homme, has a puppet on a string, which I think is actually not that far off. Because what we have there in terms of man is like a puppet, a homunculus, a little man, a man that has been determined by man, conditioned by man, to, in accordance with certain views of man and human nature, that have no template themselves. And that's the interesting thing. So if you wanted to construct a man, you would first have to have an understanding of what a man was in order to do that. In your mind, you'd have to have certain image and certain notions of what he would look like, but also how he would function. And that was what we already saw in the very first book we looked at in the Frankenstein book, that Victor Frankenstein had created a being out of the corpses of disinterred other bodies and patched them together and made this giant monster that managed to be brought to life through what he called galvanism. Electricity ran through the body and somehow it came to life. And again, Shelley, with some perspicacity, it seems to me, called that Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, because Prometheus, in the Roman account of Prometheus, he's not just a titan that is opposed to the Olympian gods, but brought about human life, gave them, infused some sort of fire from the gods and brought a being to life. And that life then was opposed and hostile towards the Olympian gods. It's actually quite a profound reflection on the Greco-Roman view of human beings in relation to the Olympian gods. And you'll see that it's not without conflict or hostility. There is hostility between the Greco-Roman view of the gods and man, and that's why you have to appease them, because there's a hostility that's already there, and the gods are not necessarily inclined towards us. They need to be propitiated through sacrifices, etc. And so Shelley uses that, and we see that Lewis continues with that discussion of human nature and the human sciences in their relation to human nature. And what Lewis observes in this work, The Abolition of Man, it seems to me, is a reflection, and it is about education, first of all. What's the title exactly? So I've gone to page 32. Let me go all the way back up to the top. The Abolition of Man, Reflections on Education with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of schools. So it is an educational treatise, at least at first blush. And he begins, and I'm not going to reiterate that. I've done that elsewhere, and I have recordings of it as well. I'm not going to reiterate his argument in the first chapter where he talks about men without chests. But the gist of it is that he argues that the central feature of education historically was the moral development of human beings. That was the chief task of education, was to allow human beings to perceive and judge and act according to certain moral attributes of human nature, which they all perceived. And he demonstrated that in various ways. And he does it in Mere Christianity as well. When he starts talking about justice, it's something that every human already understands, and we all understand that there is such a thing as right and wrong from early on. Before we're even taught what injustice is, we already know what it is. And thus, when in the playground, when a child says to another, that's not fair, he knows that the other child knows what fairness is. And that's why he's telling him that's not fair. He doesn't need to explain what fairness is. The teacher might come in and reinforce it, but actually they're already aware of it. Now, what was interesting about that in Mere Christianity is he observes that there's another dimension to this, which is when another person treats us with injustice, we see it with crystal clarity, whereas when we perpetrate the injustice, we tend to overlook it and say, well, I didn't really mean to do that, or it wasn't, that was unintentional, I didn't see that, it wasn't obvious to me. So that is what Jesus talks about, the speck in your brother's eye and the log in your own. So what that teaches us is something about the corruption and sinfulness of human nature, and an ability to see with great perspicacity the sins of other people, but to ignore our own, and to be judgmental on the basis of that. And so to try and rectify it with the problem of myopia. We're all myopic. So that's the problem, more or less, there. But with respect to education, the effect of this is to hollow out human nature and to give us no means to act as moral beings. And in that, we're striking at something that is central to the Christian notion of human nature, and actually the pagan notion of human nature, namely that we have a moral nature. And the Christian teaching is simply that we have it by virtue of the fact that we bear the image of God. So back in Genesis 1:26-27, so God created man in his own image. In his image created he him, male and female created he them. And Lewis is reflecting upon that when he deals with modern education, which ignores and in fact ridicules the very idea that education should be training in virtue. It doesn't just fail to do it, it ridicules the very idea that objective morality, or what he calls the law of human nature, even exists. And how does it ridicule it? It says that it is a subjective feeling, or it's merely a feeling we have. When we talk about aesthetics, that is the realm of beauty, or when we talk about morality, good and evil, we instantaneously dismiss those as feelings that we have that have no objective basis. And thereby, the educators dismiss moral and aesthetic education. And that, he says, is true in the English public school system, because that's where he begins it. And what's interesting about that, and he doesn't reflect on this too much, but remember, this is 1943, delivered up in the University of Durham at Newcastle at that time. What he's arguing is that his contemporaries have the same lack of moral compass as their opponents do in Nazi Germany, who were also not only acting immorally or amorally, as if there were no morality that governed their actions, but the English were deploring them for this, and eventually are going to bring them for trial for war crimes and experimenting on human beings and using eugenics and culling the population, getting rid of the surplus population, if you will, the breeders who were lesser human beings, and the Nazis, as we know famously, identified the Jews as one group, but they would have also identified the handicapped, homosexuals, and Eastern Europeans under the same group of Untermenschen, subhumans, in order to perfect human nature. And so Lewis's argument here is that practice, which we can see, and he doesn't mention it in the Abolition of Man because this is 1943. If he wrote it in 1946, he might have said the reason why that practice happens is because they deny the imago Dei in those human beings. They've denied that there is a human being there because they got rid of the category of man altogether. They have abolished man as a category that will allow us to consider the atrocity done that. Now, the Nazis are prosecuted in The Hague for crimes against humanity, but that whole prosecution begged the question of what human nature was. And what's interesting about it is the Allies knew full well from a distance that what the Nazis had done was wrong, because they saw it with perspicacity and clarity in their actions. Did they see it in their own actions, however? And I think the answer that Lewis brings us to conclude is simply they do not see it. They're myopic with respect to their own understanding of human nature. And that's reflected in their own curricula and how English is taught in schools. Now, last semester, I talked about this at greater length and spent a fair bit of time talking about what Augustine spoke about, which is the ordo amoris, right? Augustine, a sort of hierarchy of love, which really interestingly, the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, just cited, not Lewis, as far as I know, but Augustine in the Ordo Amoris, the order of love, a hierarchy of love, in which love is normed by God, but then it flows downwards to the family, etc. So there's a hierarchy or ordering of that. He said that that was understood by every human being. And Lewis clearly depicts that. And it's going to be central to the third work that we're going to look at, that hideous strength, which begins with Jane Studdock, a professor of English or a PhD student in English who's studying John Donne's love poetry. Very interesting. So dealing with the very conception of love which preoccupied C.S. Lewis in his own writing. Remember, he writes his first academic work is The Allegory of Love. His very first, and he doesn't move away from this as a topic of interest. It stays with him throughout his literary career and poetic career and critical career as a literary critic. He's very interested in this topic, and it remains of interest to us as well. But that's how he begins this, and what he is suggesting then, which I think needs to be, is what remains of interest about this work, The Abolition of Man, and that hideous strength, is that he's describing the educators of his own day, and more particularly, a type of mindset that he finds dominates there, and he's in particular interested in how it applies to modern science. Lewis wrote, my understanding is that he wrote 9 books and nearly 30 essays and several poems that explore the effect of science and its cultural impact, including The Discarded Image, that the very last book he wrote, which we looked at last semester, we looked at the beginning of the course, and he critically examined the nature of scientific revolutions, and particular the Darwinian revolution in biology. Remember, I talked about that in terms of entropy, or if you will, evolution instead of devolution. And so things were, in the modern conception, evolving upwards, climbing to the summit, and we are now at the summit looking downwards and backwards, as opposed to the Christian view, which sees us at the foot of the mountain and regarding our forebears as our teachers, and we're standing on their shoulders. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were, and we're seeking to recover the lost ruins of our first parents, as Milton puts it in Of Education. There's a difference in perspective there, and at the summit there is the modern view. Now, the modern view, I'm gonna give you a pictorial image here, because before I talk about the abolition of man, but I wanted you to note that Lewis is very skeptical about science. Now, it's not that he distrusts science per se, but he's skeptical of scientism. And if it were my subject today, I could say that at greater length, but I recommend this book as a discussion of that. So it's called The Magician's Twin, C.S. Lewis on Science, Scientism, and Society, because it is in particular scientism that he is critical of. The view that science determines what science is and nobody else can unless they're a scientist. It's immune from criticism from without. And Lewis says that attitude and that defense of science and the appeal to trust the science is characteristic of an age that has given itself over to conditioners and allows human beings no recourse to stop the conditioning. And Lewis fights against this tendency with all of his might and defends freedom and virtue throughout his novels, because virtue, remember, is the Tao, the chest, the very thing that modern education seeks to undermine, is the very thing that will allow us to resist the unjust incursion of science into our world and our thinking. So I want to show this the change in perspective here, and because I find visual images are a really helpful way of conceptualizing or seeing what Lewis is talking about here. Now think about the imago Dei in terms of the physical appearance of a human being and how it's portrayed in Western art historically. So for example, this is Leonardo da Vinci, the Virgin of the Rocks, and what we have here is the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. This will be John the Baptist, him worshiping his son, him holding that I've got two natures, got the two fingers up. He's not saying peace, man. He's saying I have a divine nature and a human nature. That's, signified here. We have an angel here looking down, but this sort of triangular portrait which is characteristic of Renaissance art, the golden triangle and so forth. So that little portrait, we can see it in another form here in the beautiful Pietà of Michelangelo. He carved 4 of them. This one he did at 24. Extraordinary. This is the one at St. Peter's in the Vatican, and polished it to a fine beauty. But again, you can see the sort of the triangle here. Here's the dead Christ lying on his mother's lap. Just an extraordinarily beautiful scene. But we have the imago Dei here reflected in a human being. And that sense that this is mom, this is her son, but it's also God. It's not just a human being. There's a sense of the divine in the human. In fact, in Christian theology, the two truths are necessary and not contradictory. He's fully God and fully human, as he says here with the 2 fingers. 1, 2. I have 2 natures. You're not worshiping a baby. You're worshiping God in human flesh. Same thing being portrayed here. And if you want to see that as the beginning point for how the imago Dei is portrayed in Western art, which I think is a good starting point. So it's the central feature of art. Note that the paintings that we have, the earliest, will portray in medieval art, will portray Jesus in a less realistic form. I'm not going to, this isn't a class on painting, but we could talk about that. But here the focus is on man. It's a focus, and it's clear, it's front and center. We're interested in the foreground. Better with the painting here to illustrate this. What's the significance of the background in this painting? Nothing. Our attention's all in the foreground. It's on Mary, and to a lesser extent, I think, in some ways, it's on Jesus, but it's actually on Mary. She is the primary focus of attention in this portrait. Again, here, it's Mary's compassion for Jesus that is the central focus. Now, we can talk about that, whether that's correct theologically, and we'll have a dispute with our Catholic brethren on this front. And again, this is in the painting class or theology class, but I'm just noting that it is a human compassion, the love of Mary for her son, that is in view in both of these. Front and center, we're looking at the front and center, and the background is actually very insignificant. Whereas here, in the Romantic painting, I've used this illustration before, in the Romantic painting by Caspar David Friedrich, we see the change in perspective best represented in my view. That illustrates the change. Again, we have the triangle. The focus is in some sense on this fellow, but note that we don't see his face. We see the back of his head. And the focus of the painting actually is not upon him, although he is in the foreground. It's on what he is looking at, and that's why his back is turned to us. We're looking at what he's looking at, so our attention is not to the foreground, but to the background. And of great significance to him, although you can't portray this in a painting, is what is he thinking or what is he feeling? Because we can't see it in his face. It's his feelings about what he sees, but what he sees is almost imperceptible. It's very difficult to see. It's a fog. But he's at the summit of a mountain, and he represents the Romantic view of human nature, the perspective that Lewis called evolutionary as opposed to devolutionary, whereby we're at the summit of a mountain representing human nature. The contemporary world is at the summit of a mountain looking out into the horizon, which is a sublime landscape, and our feelings in relation to that are the main subject matter of art, culture, etc., and science for that matter. It's not amenable to reasoning, because reasoning is something that we could see and analyze and diagnose. It's more a matter of the passions, yet ungoverned by virtue. And that's Lewis's argument in The Abolition of Man. We have a passionate man whose feelings are the central focus of this painting, and yet there's no sense that the classical ideas of proportion or order or objective morality govern his feelings at all. And they don't. They're now irrelevant. And The Abolition of Man is already announced fully by the time the Romantics are writing. They also think that our feelings are not governed by a moral order, rather our feelings are the moral order. And furthermore, those feelings are, as Friedrich Nietzsche will go on to say, beyond the discussion of good and evil. They're just strong feelings. There's no such thing as a wrong feeling. There's only a strong feeling, stronger or weaker. And the category of the sublime is connected with power over nature. Or actually, it's the other way around. It's powerlessness in the face of nature. So this man standing on the top of a summit, looking out into the background, could easily fall into the precipice in front of him. He feels the immensity of the scene. He's climbed to the summit, and he feels a sense of awe and terror. And yet that feeling that he perceives comes from him, not from without. He's the source of the feeling of terror. Connected with, as I say, power, in accordance with Edmund Burke. Again, I could point you to the lectures I've given on this, in conjunction with this category of aesthetic perception that he calls the sublime. It's a feeling of powerlessness in the face of immensity or eternity. Whereas the beautiful is the exact opposite. We feel powerful over something that we can perceive. So, for example, this is beautiful. Why is it beautiful? Because we have the powerless Christ lying dead in his mother's arms. That's beautiful. A body. Not a Frankenstein body, but a beautiful male form. And she's pitying him. It's called the pietà. Likewise here, the Christ child is a baby, chubby, fat little baby. Beautiful in some ways, and the whole picture is beautiful. Mary's face is beautiful. The angel is beautiful. There's beautiful faces. There's beauty here. But note that, again, their faces, there is no face here. So there's no humanity in that picture. And so if we don't have an image of what a human being is, then we have a view of human nature that is not going to be related to something beautiful or good or true, but rather something that the educators are going to construct for themselves in accordance with their understanding of themselves, which is going to fit something like this wonderful visual image that the editors of this French edition of the Abolition of Man have constructed, a marionette on the fingers of the conditioner. So let me go back to the book itself. And I think it was page 32. Right there. So it seems to me that what Lewis is going to describe then, having described the character of modern education to get rid of moral education altogether. Not only remove it from its centrality in education, but to remove it altogether. And as a result, produce what he calls men without chests, without any moral character, who think themselves beyond good and evil, and as a consequence are going to act as if there are no such things as good acts or any such thing as evil acts. And then they will be driven by what? If they don't have a chest, they'll be driven by their passions. So their passions and the strength of their feelings are going to drive all of their, what we will still call moral actions, because we have no other way of describing it. And what they then will almost invariably do is act in accordance with evil, strong feelings. This is a very philosophical way of presenting it. And I think that philosophy is very useful, although philosophy needs to be accompanied by literature, and literature is a better teacher than philosophy. It's simply better. It's not that it's another way of looking at it, it's a better way of looking at it. Because our philosophy argues an abstraction, and literature argues the same thing, but it does through persuasion. And it does, so philosophy says the truth, and literature shows it. And the showing of it, the visual image of it, the incarnation of it, removes it from the realm of abstraction to the realm of experience. And human beings learn through experience, chiefly, and through imitation. So says Aristotle himself. And my proof of this, whenever I want to argue with philosophers on this, which I don't too much because I appreciate the philosophers too much, is to appeal to Scripture itself, because in Scripture, God chooses to teach mankind its most important theological and moral lessons through story. He doesn't do it through abstract eternal truth like Plato does. He does it through Acts. You could even say the book of Acts, but all the historical books, most of the historical genre is the main genre of literature in the Bible, and it's primarily showing the acts of people and God in relation to people and how God works in history. And in wisdom literature, they're largely commentary on the historical books, which is interesting. So the wisdom literature is not wisdom and abstraction, but wisdom contemplating what good actions were. So if you want to look at Proverbs, first 9 books, we have Lady Wisdom talking about living a good life. It's very practical. It's not abstract. It's the opposite. It's, if you do this, here's the outcome of that action. Whereas if you do that, so you listen to Lady Philosophy, or you the voice of wisdom, or you can listen to the harlot who's going to corrupt you and destroy you. So it's the concrete presentation of things. And so what happens then when we move from an age that objectifies beauty and objectifies story in painting and move towards one that subjectifies it, like this one, makes it a subjectification, is that we lose the instructive purpose of literature altogether. And again, Lewis's fiction is trying to reinsert, and Tolkien's is going to do the exact same thing, to reinsert a moral framework into the story in the best way that they can. Lewis will do it by argument as well. As I say, his literary critical works and his philosophical works, his apologetics works, will describe it in some ways. But his best proof of his argument is not in argument, but rather in story. Just like in Tolkien. Tolkien is even more strongly so. He incarnates a philosophy that he already has. I could go on about that, and I will go on at another point, but let's go to the Abolition of Man and see how he does or describes the consequence of a certain view of man in relation to nature, whereby nature is seen as this. It's grand, it's got grandeur about it. It gives us a sense of the divinity. It's something that we worship. Because that's another thing here. He's standing in the awesome presence of this landscape, and he feels a sense of awe and worship, a natural sense of awe and worship, in the same way that little John the Baptist does towards the Christ child. In the same way, there's an object of worship. And here the object of worship is in the background, which is ironically the main focus of the painting. We're looking into the background and we're worshiping something that is obscure and ourselves in relation to it. So we're worshiping our feelings in relation to the obscure background of the painting. So with that said, the abolition of man. And he begins it with this. Man's conquest of nature is an expression often used to describe the progress of applied science. Man has nature whacked, said someone to a friend of mine not long ago. In their context, the words had a certain tragic beauty, for the speaker was dying of tuberculosis. So he was thinking that he would die, but in the end, modern science would cure tuberculosis. And even though he was going to be a casualty along the way of death, the human race would overcome it and put it under our feet. It would dominate it. No matter, he said, I know I'm one of the casualties. Of course, there are casualties on the winning as well as on the losing side, but that doesn't alter the fact that it is winning. Lewis regularly does this with all of his essays, by the way. He begins a little anecdote and then he pulls you into it. It's a classical mode of argumentation. Should be used in preaching as well. Lewis says, I've chosen this story as my point of departure in order to make it clear that I do not wish to disparage all that is really beneficial in the process, described as, quote, man's conquest, much less that all real devotion and self-sacrifice that has gone to it to make it possible. But having done so, I must proceed to analyze this conception a little bit more closely. In what sense is man the possessor of increasing power over nature? Because man's got nature whacked is the same thing as to say that science has given us everything good in life. We have to trust the science because it serves us well. Or rather, when we worship it, it delivers us a better life. Let's consider 3 typical examples of this. And Lewis's examples are going to sound a little bit obsolete now, but not entirely. Illustrations of the same sort of thing. We have 1, the airplane, 2, the wireless, and 3, the contraceptive. So an airplane, we still have the wireless. We can replace it with a cell phone. It's a means of communication at great distance. And thirdly, contraceptives, we also still have the pill or a condom or whatever, a means of preventing the insemination of an egg and life ensuing, human life. In a civilized community in peacetime, anyone who can pay for them may use these things, these 3 things. But it cannot strictly be said that when he does so, he is exercising his own proper or individual power over nature. If I pay you to carry me, I am not therefore myself a strong man. If I have a technological mean of taking me to the other side of the world, it doesn't make me any stronger, just like the airplane. If I pay you to carry me, it doesn't mean I have your strength. I've harnessed it, but I am not stronger as a consequence. Any or all of the 3 things I've mentioned can be withheld, he notes, from some men by other men, by those who sell or those who allow the sale or those who own the sources of production or those who make the goods. So somebody can say, we're going to deprive you from air travel, from using your cell phone, or from using contraception. Some people may decide to do any of those things. And so the power that you had by using them is extrinsic to you. Your human nature is not changed in any way, other than that you are appealing to them as the basis for your superiority as a man. You're standing on the hill looking out and you feel empowered by the technological means that have delivered to you this existence that you have that previous generations didn't have. Again, as regards the powers manifested in the airplane or the wireless, man is as much the patient or subject as the possessor, since he is the target both for bombs and for propaganda. Airplanes can drop bombs, airplanes can be used as weapons, suicide bombers, and the wireless that will communicate to the other side of the planet can also give you, in your wireless now, your cell phone, all the means by which people want to condition you, not just how you want to communicate, but how the owners of the technology want to communicate to you, and they can throttle what images you see. They can, so you are gain power over it, but you are also having power exercised upon you. And if you think it's a neutral exchange, then you're extraordinarily naive. I don't think anyone is naive like this anymore. But Lewis's point is simply, it's not, at best, any power we get is also a power that can be used against us. But the third illustration, the contraceptive, is the one he's going to want to dig down, and I find this one really interesting. And as regards contraceptives, there is a paradoxical negative sense in which all possible future generations are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those already alive. I never hear this argument being made, but it's a potent argument. In the discussion of contraception, pro-life, pro-choice, all that, how about the power, and how about the depriving of choice of those of future generations, which is entailed in the act of contraception? Never mind the technology itself, but the act of contraception deprives people of their choice and their life. And they are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those already alive. By contraception, simply, they are denied existence. By contraception, used as a means of selective breeding. There he goes. Eugenics. But now it's not for the betterment of the race, it's for the betterment of me and my comfort and my context. It's selective in the sense that I'm selecting to stop a life that I don't even know the nature of. That could be a future world leader, a future genius. Or it could be a very bad individual. I have no idea. I've selected not to have that life enter the world. So in that sense, selective breedings, and in that sense, eugenics. And the eugenics then regards me as the superior being and everything below me inferior or non-existent, inconsequential in the consideration. They are, without their concurring voice, made to be what one generation, for its own reasons, may choose to prefer. In other words, exercise power over. From this point of view, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. So now he really flips what science delivers us, because remember, in Francis Bacon's Science, he even describes the aim of science is to gain power over nature in a way that had never been done before. Modern education, modern knowledge, modern science is to be used to gain greater power from humanity, from nature. And now the nature that is we're gaining power over is not the world outside man, but man himself is the subject of this power play. And Lewis talks about that in his De Descriptione Temporum. If I cited this earlier, I think. Didn't I? We didn't look at it in this class. We looked at it, I believe, in the other class when we looked at C.S. Lewis. I don't know if I can pull it up quickly here. I probably can't. But he talks about, before the 19th century, science was wielded outside of ourselves upon nature, and we gained some benefits from that. We were squeezing the fruit very hard and getting a lot of juice in it. But come the 19th century, man himself becomes the object that we seek to gain power over. And at that point, Darwin starts monkeying around with human beings, and Freud with his mind, and Marx with his social order, because now we are the subject that is being gained power over by our fellow man. And all of it is begging the question of, what do we mean by a man? And there is no, it's an empty category, other than we see people in front of us, but we're denying something in the definition at the very outset, which is, what exactly is a human being that we're experimenting on? It's begging the question. It is, of course, a commonplace to complain that men have hitherto used badly and against their fellows the powers that science has given them. But that is not the point I am trying to make. I am not speaking of particular corruption and abuse, which an increase of moral virtue could cure. I am considering what the thing called man's power over nature must always and essentially be. It is a philosophical objection. It is not a an objection to an abuse of a power. It's an objection to the very perspective. The very perspective is in view. What do we mean, and what happens when the background is the foreground, when nature becomes the thing that we worship, and when we worship nature, actually what we're really worshiping is our feelings in relation to that nature. What happens if we divinize the feeling of awe within ourselves and make that the God that we bow down and worship to? Nihilism ensues. We are beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche calls it, because Nietzsche is hugely influenced by the Romantics and their conception of human nature here. No doubt the picture could be modified by public ownership of raw materials and factories and public control of scientific research, but unless we have a world state, and note that contemporaneous with this, both H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley envisage exactly that scenario, which we call dystopian fiction, a world state. This will still mean the power of one nation over others. Okay, so how do we solve that problem? By a United Nations. And by the way, Julian Huxley is one of the founders, Aldous Huxley's brother is one of the founders of the United Nations. So it's solving the particularity of one nation by making it humanity as a whole, acting in concert. And even within the world state or the nation, it will mean in principle the power of majorities over minorities, and in the concrete of a government over the people. These are not speculative on his part. He's describing what's happening in his own day, and we can still see in our own day as well. And all long-term exercises of power, especially in breeding, must mean the power of earlier generations over later ones. And this is his key point. It's deciding that the present and the present needs outweigh the views of the past and the people of the future. It's annihilating all human considerations in the discussion of utility. So I've already said to you many times, even in my classes, that the perspective taken in the Romantic period on virtue is represented by the orphan, and the orphan is cut off from his past because he doesn't know his parents. He can't look to them for guidance. He looks within himself for how to live. And the novel that springs out of it is called the Bildungsroman. He teaches himself going forward. This adds another dimension to it. The orphan that looks forward is also not considering the future. He's only considering the present moment. And the consequences of it, he doesn't even contemplate for the most part. And this latter point, he says, is not always sufficiently emphasized because those who write on social matters have not yet learned to imitate the physicists by always including time among the dimensions. Not just space, but time. Remember Lewis and Tolkien? I said Lewis and Tolkien, when they began this enterprise of writing science fiction or thought about it, Tolkien was going to consider time, and Lewis was going to do it in accordance with space. Now, because Tolkien didn't do what he said he would do, Lewis considered time as well in his context, right? And so time becomes a factor in Lewis's fiction, which it probably wouldn't have been when he started out. When he wrote the Out of the Silent Planet, he was only considering space, but not time. And after Tolkien decides he's going to write The Lord of the Rings and never mind with all of this, Lewis decides to pull the issue of time into the equation here. But in order to fully understand what man's power over nature, and therefore the power of some men over other men, really means, we must picture the race extended in time from the date of its emergence to that of its extinction. Each generation exercises power over its successors. That is true, by the way, irrespective of how you do it. Whatever choices you make right now will affect your children and their children and so on down the road. There's a consequential, it's a historical, the human race, there is a unity about it in many ways. And we lament what foregoing generations did or did not do. We will praise them for their good conduct. We will deplore them for their evil conduct. But what we can't do is pretend that there is no effect to their conduct. And he says that each generation exercises power over its successors, and each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it and rebels against tradition, resists and limits the power of its predecessors. And this is exactly what a rebellion against tradition is trying to do. It's trying to say that the past, we utterly deplore it, and we are going to emancipate ourselves from the past. We're not going to be taught by previous generations. And the Enlightenment believes this very strongly. The Enlightenment is anti-traditional, and it favors the concept of autonomy, which again is the law of the self. And here's the self in a natural landscape. He's not in the city. Now, so when we announce ourselves to be modern in our sympathies, all we're saying is that we don't need to read what previous generations said. We don't need to consider the wisdom of others' conduct. We can determine for ourselves what is good and evil, what's right and wrong, in accordance with our present situation. We can act as if we were the only people who ever lived. This modifies the picture which is sometimes painted of a progressive emancipation from tradition and a progressive control of natural processes, resulting in a continual increase of human power. Note that it's all good. Get rid of that, get stronger and stronger. In reality, of course, if any one age really attains by eugenics and scientific education, as it's portrayed in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, or in H.G. Wells's First Men in the Moon. It's a positive view of the power of science. If it gains the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power. They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. Thought control, mind control, action control, relentless propaganda, conception of yourself in relation to a disembodied sense of self, which you can see on a screen when doing a Zoom call or whatever. Seeing yourself only as the image on the screen, you might not like your own picture, well then just blank that out. You can see somebody else on the other side. I get the power without any of the downsides of having to look at my own mug in the picture. So it rather changes. When he says it modifies, it totally transforms it. In reality, of course, if we change it, then it makes all men weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. And if, as is almost certain, the age which had thus attained maximum power over posterity, that is, over the future, were also the age most emancipated from tradition, it would be engaged in reducing the power of its predecessors almost as drastically as that of its successors. In other words, the man of the present who diminishes the power of the past, and by using birth control over the future, gains all of his power at the expense of the rest of the human race, which he has weakened to the point where they may not even exist anymore. He's going to seek to annihilate them. Or he's going to annihilate them whether he seeks to or not. But to gain that power. And we must also remember that quite apart from this, the later a generation comes, the nearer it lives to that date at which the species becomes extinct, the less power it will have in the forward direction because its subjects will be so few. So if global warming and the carbon footprint things and people don't have children in order to save the planet, what we're doing is depriving humanity of its dominion over the earth and actually exercising power in a way that annihilates every other human being, and we're doing it in the name of humane action. It's an extraordinary thing, and Lewis sees it as nothing other than diabolical, and that's in the third installment of that of the sci-fi trilogy, that Hideous Strength. What he introduces in Perelandra, in the possession of Weston, the scientist who has given himself over to pure spirituality, as just one of the dimensions there. In that Hideous Strength, it is almost wholly a spiritual cosmic war and becomes very lurid in that sense, and it becomes very unrealistic, if you will. And if you'd started the series as that, you would never have bought into the idea that what we are talking about in the exercise of modern science is nothing else than a spiritual battle against all flesh and all incarnation. It's not only trying to stop this incarnation and the consequence of the death of this fellow before he goes into the grave and rises from it, because here's the body. The passion is Mary contemplating the body of her dead son and her feelings about this before that dead son rises from the grave and becomes the Lord of glory, right? And it's focusing on something that is actually inconsequential to the whole act of the resurrection, namely his death. His death is an atoning thing, but it's meaningless. Mary's feelings about Jesus' death are meaningless if that boy does not rise from the grave and now lives and reigns with the Father in heaven, the triune God. But that incarnational perspective then becomes the exact opposite. Well, I don't even know what we call it, an excarnational perspective. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. We move from incarnation to excarnation, to spirituality. So we have a spiritual sense of the future without thinking of people as actual physical beings or seeing ourselves as physical beings with physical natures whose bodies matter to our human nature. And so even if we treat them biochemically through medications and pills and chemicals, we actually think that in some sense their true self is not these things, or is reducible to those things, but it's unclear the relation between the spirit and the body then at any rate. But at any rate, he goes on, there is therefore no question of a power vested in the race as a whole, steadily growing as long as the race survives. The last men, far from being the heirs of power, will be of all men most subject to the dead hand of the great planners and conditioners, and will themselves exercise least power upon that picture. So here's why he just flips it on its head. When we say we have nature whipped and we've gained power over human nature, he actually says that power which we in our present moment enjoy is literally the pinnacle of possible power. And if it is exercised in the way that we are currently doing so, the consequence will be the annihilation of the whole human race. That's what he's saying. So the real picture is that of one dominant age. Let's suppose the 100th century AD, not the 20th, but the 100th, which resists all previous ages most successfully and dominates all subsequent ages most irresistibly, and thus is the real master of the human species. So we gain power over incarnation and incarnate nature by depriving humanity of all incarnation. So it is a theological assault of the first order, but it comes not through attacks on theology, but through attacks on anthropology, which is why the heresies, I've said consistently, and I have profound theological friends that have said this to me themselves over the years, the main heresies of our day are anthropological in nature. And thus the humanities is the new venue for theological attacks. When this master generation, itself an infinitesimal minority of the species, the power will be exercised by a minority smaller still. So it'll be a little cadre of individuals who are exercising their power over the remaining, the conditioners. Man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. There neither is nor can be any simple increase of power on man's side. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger. In every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he's also the prisoner who follows the triumphal card. I was thinking about a Roman procession where the prisoners are behind, and here the prisoners are humanity in its huge masses, and the who's driving the car? Well, a couple of conditioners in the car. I'm not yet considering whether the total results of such ambivalent victories is a good thing or bad. I'm only making clear what man's conquest of nature really means, and especially that final stage, which perhaps is not far off. The final stages come when man, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, Aldous Huxley, and by an education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology, has obtained full control over himself. Exactly what our contemporary educators are seeking to do in the sciences, in the human, in the social sciences, in psychology. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won. We shall then have taken the thread of life out of the hand of Clotho and be henceforth free to make our species whatever we wish it to be. The battle will indeed be won, but who precisely will have won it? Because the power of the conditioners to gain that power over human nature comes at expense of the thing that they share in common, and what they share in common, they haven't just deprived it of the mass of humanity, but they've deprived themselves of the very same thing. And this is where he goes in the Abolition of Man. Do you see the problem? They denied human nature to the people that they're gaining power over, but by denying them their humanity, they're denying them themselves the very thing that makes them who they are. So they'll become inhumane. They'll be unmen, to use the illustration that you just had from Perelandra. They will be unmen, and who will be pulling the strings for the unmen? Yes. They are oblivious to the fact. So the conditioners, and when we say they, who's the they? The they is the conditioners. He makes that clear in chapter 1. The conditioners are the educators, but the type of it, it's not educators in general, it's a type of education which treats other human beings as objects in an experiment, as if they didn't share anything common with that. And so he gives an illustration. He says it's the way, rather than being like an adult bird teaching a young bird to fly, which is traditional education. Here's the good, and I'm going to demonstrate the good life for you, and I'm going to exemplify that in my conduct. So it's the process of imitation, imitatio Christi. You know, what would Jesus do? But the imitation of Christ, but the imitation of a human being, we can see it in Greek literature as well. Odysseus modeling that to Telemachus, or Mentor, the lady wisdom Athena exemplifying good, virtuous conduct to a young man. Instead of that type of approach, we regard children to be the way a poultry farmer looks at poultry. In other words, we do to other people what we would never do to ourselves. So it is a sort of act that we exercise in power over others that disempowers us without our knowledge. So we think that we're exercising power, but the very thing we're exercising power over is human nature, and we lose in that process. We can't win. It's an ever diminishing return. For all the power you gain, you lose your humanity. What would it profit a man if he gained the whole world but lost his soul? So he's describing the loss of the soul in the educational process. And it's a type of education. I hesitate to even call it education. He calls it conditioning. And that's probably right, because it considers human beings as objects that can be conditioned just as we can with animals, because animals will work through Pavlovian type of conditioning. And human beings to some degree respond to that, but there's something about them that is being denied in that process, namely their freedom and their moral nature. And the fact that they are human beings like us. And if power is the only thing that we see as the difference between the child and the adult, which is, by the way, what the public education system does, by the way. So a teacher can't, the one prohibition is an abuse of power. You can do all sorts of immoral things. You can teach immorality. You can act immorally. But you would not be brought up on charges for immoral actions. You would be brought up on charges for an abuse of power. That's it. Right? No? Well, look at how teachers are brought to discipline. It is over an abuse of power, even though that wasn't really the issue there. The power of man to make himself what he pleases means, as we've seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please. In all ages, no doubt, nurture and instruction have, in some sense, attempted to exercise this power, but the situation in which we must look forward will be novel in two respects. In the first place, the power over other generations will be enormously increased. Hitherto, the plans of educationalists have achieved very little of what they attempted, and indeed, when we read them, how Plato would have every infant, quote, a bastard nursed in a bureau. Look at his work, The Republic, where you take away children from the adults and they'd be brought under the rule of professional educators. And Eliot would have the boy see no men before the age of 7, and after that no women, and how Locke wants children to have leaky shoes and no turn for poetry. We may well thank the beneficence, obstinacy of real mothers, real nurses, and above all real children for the preserving their human race in such sanity as it still possesses. He could have given a biblical example. We could thank the Hebrew midwives that they didn't listen to Pharaoh, because they would have killed all the firstborn. They didn't. They wouldn't do it. So thank God that human beings resisted the tyranny of those in power. But the man molders of the new age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state and an irresistible scientific technique. We shall get at last a race of conditioners who really can cut out all the posterity in what shape they please. So it could create little human beings, fewer human beings. It could change what we call human nature to include gender and other fictive categories. Or it could just remove them altogether as the ideal, depending on how demonically attuned they are. But the second difference is even more important. In the older system, both the kind of men the teachers wished to produce, namely virtuous or godly, and their motives for producing them were just prescribed by the Tao, a norm to which the teachers themselves were subject and from which they claimed no liberty to depart. So as a teacher, I myself am subject to a view of human nature that is beyond my reach to even dispute. I may not do certain things to you by virtue of the fact that you bear the imago Dei, whether you're powerless or powerful. I may not. It's wrong. Including your own children. Doesn't matter if they're your children. You may not do certain things. And that you can see that in even after mankind is wiped out in the flood of Noah, that again in Genesis 9, that even though God has just done it, let me just put this here. Just bring it to your attention. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. After he's just wiped out all life. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, every fowl, every moving thing that liveth will be meat for you, etc. But flesh with the life thereof you shall. And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man, at the hand of every brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Why is human life so precious to God? After having just wiped out, aside from Noah and his children, the whole human race, because we bear the image of God and he can determine to take it or not. And it's not for us to do it because we always bear the image of God. So there's the firewall, an absolute firewall. And you be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly on the earth and multiply therein. So it's a reiteration of the dominion mandate in Genesis 1, 28, 29. But note, why can you not kill? For in the image of God made he man. That's why. That's the Tao as well. That's a theological justification. It's also moral justification because God, in whose image we're made, is good. And he called things good, including mankind. He said it was very good. Now a fallen thing, but still good. And we bear that image. We can't take human life. We also can't deprive humanity of life through then contraception, willy-nilly. Because it's the power over human nature that deprives them of life. They did not cut men to the same pattern they had chosen. They handed on what they had received. They initiated the young neophyte into the mystery of humanity, which overarched him and them alike. It was but old birds teaching young birds to fly. This will be changed. The new education, the conditioning. Judgments of value are to be produced in the pupil as part of the conditioning, but it's not something that stands above the conditioning. There's no moral order. The moral order will be a new moral order that the conditioners will decide is moral. Whatever Tao there is will be the product, not the motive of education. There's another good way of putting it. It will be the product of education. Moral people, without any discussion of what morality was, let alone to see that it is an eternal one. The conditioners have been emancipated from all that. Now, here's the terrible part of that. It is one more part of nature which they have conquered. The ultimate springs of human action are no longer for them something given. They have surrendered like electricity. It is the function of the conditioners to control, not to obey them. That is the laws. They control the laws, they don't obey the laws. They're above the law. Just like Uncle Andrew in the Magician's Nephew. Right? Uncle Andrew sees that the moral laws of treating human beings like lab rats don't apply to him. They know how to produce conscience and decide what kind of consciousness they will produce. They themselves are outside above. For we are assuming the last man's stage of struggle with nature. The final victory has been won. Human nature has been conquered, and of course has conquered in whatever sense those words may now bear. And they will choose, therefore, what this is. Now, the problem with this that he then expands upon is that the conditioners themselves, sort of like in the French Revolution, they attack tradition, they chop up the head of the king, but then within them, there is this concept, you've cut off the king and lawful authority. What's the new law? Well, it's the one I declare. But what if the people beneath you regard you as unjust, they're going to do the same to you. And they will keep on going. There's no end to that. And there will be no moral restraint upon it, because we've denied the legitimacy of moral considerations in the whole exercise. And thus, at first, they may look upon themselves as servants and guardians of humanity, just like we see in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and conceive that they have a duty to do it good. But it is only by confusion that they remain in this state. They recognize the concept of duty as a result of certain processes which they can now control. So if you can control the whole process, then the process actually doesn't determine you at all, and you can decide to jump ahead of the process. There is no law that will restrain you. You are the man of lawlessness. That is how Lewis will describe the characters that we will meet in that hideous strength. In a modern research university, he shows a collection of characters, all of whom see their unique situation to gain control over all of life. And they're really excited about it. They have a lot of power, and they can change the course of the future as well as the past. And behind all of that is a demonic force that will empower all these men who see themselves this way but not realizing that they have no faces and they have no moral nature, and that this thing that they worship with awe, the nothingness and the abyss, is also within them. And really what the spiritual powers that manipulate them into thinking they're gaining power are doing is depriving them of their humanity, and they actually want them all dead, because they're not really on their side. They're against humanity in general. These are just what do we call these? The useless idiots in the communist regimes. So you get the people that think they're gaining power, and they do for a time, until they realize that actually they were just a tool for annihilation. Anyway, we'll get to that next time. I spent the whole class, and I'm not that surprised, really. But neither are you. That hideous strength when we get back after the break, and I guess we are having a break now, right? Yes. Okay, well, I'll see you then.